Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, Chapter 1. And what is good, Phaedrus, and what is not good? Need we ask anyone to tell us these things? Isn't it the case that we do indeed know what is good? And I don't mean this from the point of view of morals or ethics. I mean as a felt sense of what's good, and not just positive emotion, because there are many things that can induce positive emotion, not all of them the actual good. A hug from your mother or a hit of crack can both induce positive emotions. So I'm talking about the good with a capital G, which has an additional layer. And this layer is a feeling kind of satisfaction and harmony, that you just know what's right. And I think it's that harmony that separates what is good from what just feels good. The quote was adapted by Pirsig from Plato's Phaedrus dialogue, and thanks to Wikipedia, we can look the original right up. And what is well, and what is badly? Need we ask Lysias or any other poet or orator who ever wrote or who will write either a political or any other work, in meter or out of meter, poet or prose writer, to teach us this? So chapter 1 begins with a journey from Minnesota to, we know they're going to end in Montana, but we don't know where after that, because the emphasis is on to travel rather than arrive anywhere. And we want to make good time, but for us now, this is measured with the emphasis on good rather than time. And when you make that shift in emphasis, the whole approach changes. The narrator, in a way, feels foolish to realize that there were wonderful back roads all along, and that we somehow are mesmerized into believing that something superior exists in the cities and metropolitan areas, because that's where all the action is. But all along, what was truly satisfying was there by traveling the back roads. I've wondered why it took us so long to catch on. We saw it, and yet we didn't see it. Or rather, we were trained not to see it, conned perhaps into thinking that the real action was metropolitan, and that all this was just boring hinterland. It was a puzzling thing. The truth knocks on the door, and you say, "Go away, I'm looking for the truth." And so it goes away. Puzzling. I love that line. And there are other lines I really love too, and here's another one. So as the narrator's writing, he is riding a motorcycle. He is looking at the marshes as he passes. I have seen these marshes 1,000 times, yet each time they're new. It's wrong to call them benign. You could just as well call them cruel and senseless. They are all of those things, but the reality of them overwhelms halfway conceptions. There, a huge flock of red-winged blackbirds ascends from nests in the cattails, startled by our sound. What I love here is that line, the reality of them overwhelms halfway conceptions, and I think it's a really good idea to remember that an immediate experienced reality does indeed exist outside our halfway conceptions. Another line I really like concerns his travel partner, Sylvia. She has, that they're at a picnic stop and they're resting. And she's kind of has a dreary look on her face and countenance. And she has just seen a procession of people going to work on their cars the other way from what they're coming. And this leads her to conclude that there's innate gloom to them, when really it's just a standard facial expression of a Monday morning commuter, but she's a romantic. So she's deeply affected by surface perception, let's just say. I can see what she's saying, but logically it just doesn't go anywhere. You work to live, and that's what they were doing. I was watching swamps, I say. After a while she looks up and says, "What do you see?" There was a whole flock of red-winged blackbirds. They rose up suddenly when we went by. Oh, I was happy to see them again. They tie things together, thoughts and such, you know? She thinks for a while, and then, with the trees behind her, a deep green, she smiles. She understands a particular language which has nothing to do with what you were saying. A daughter. Yes, she says, they're beautiful. Watch for them, I say. All right. A daughter. I wonder what he means by that. Interesting. The only thing I can think is maybe when you're with a child, they have an understanding on a different level from what you're actually, from what your words are actually saying. So maybe like his daughter, I don't know. Most of the themes in the book will be exposed in a sort of essay lecture by the narrator, and they're called by the narrator chautauquas. And if you don't know what a chautauqua is, I'll just read from the book. Like the traveling tent show chautauquas that used to move across America, this America, the one we are in now, the one we are now in, an old-time series of popular talks intended to edify and entertain, improve the mind, and bring culture and enlightenment to the ears and thoughts of the hearer. The chautauquas were pushed aside by faster-paced radio, movies, and TV, and it seems to me the change was not entirely an improvement. Well, that's something we can certainly relate to, whether, as we kind of figure, is the internet an improvement? So you see this theme emerging, which is, what the hell are we going to do about rapidly changing technology? And this is why this book, because he's identified this early on, like great geniuses do. And this is why this book could potentially be of great help in navigating what we're looking at right now. For example, he indicates that in history, dogma pretty much let us know what was best. And that was quite static. The ruts were too deep, not much possibility of change, but now we are suffering with what is too shallow. The stream of consciousness is too broad and too shallow. And this is sort of what you could characterize, like John Vervaeke, who I'm watching a lot now, characterizes as the meaning crisis and what Ken Wilber calls pathological green. In this Chautauqua, I would like not to cut any new channels of consciousness, but simply dig deeper into old ones that have become silted with the debris of thoughts grown stale and platitudes too often repeated. What's new is an interesting and broadening eternal question, but one, if pursued exclusively, results only in an endless parade of trivia and fashion, the silt of tomorrow. I would like instead to be concerned with the question, what's best? A question which cuts deeply rather than broadly, a question whose answers tend to move the silt downstream. There are eras of human history in which the channels of thought have been too deeply cut and no change was possible, and nothing ever happened, and best was a matter of dogma. But that is not the situation now. Now the stream of our common consciousness seems to be obliterating its own banks, losing its central direction and purpose, flooding the lowlands, disconnecting and isolating the highlands, and to no particular purpose other than the wasteful fulfillment of its own internal momentum. Some channel deepening seems called for. So this first Chautauqua is the beginning of understanding, as he says, of what's best, of what ends up being quality. But it also lays out the basics of, or lays out the structure of the philosophy of the metaphysics of quality. And this is our first inkling of this. And one of the reasons I'm interested in reading the books again is to sort of trace the trajectory of the emergence of the theory. This attempt to understand what is best begins with a perplexing problem. So if you're on a long motorcycle trip, you should probably know how to do a little bit of maintenance. But for some reason, there are people, such as his traveling partner John, who just won't do it. And there are people who just can't handle this kind of thing. And that would be John and his wife Sylvia, John and Sylvia Sutherland. They cannot handle it. John refuses to maintain his motorcycle himself, and he's put off by it to the point that it obviously causes him both pain and frustration and actual problems. He avoids talking about it at all if possible, even if this obviously is not a really good way to do a long motorcycle trip. Also, John and Sylvia have a dripping tap in their house, and aside from just throwing a washer in there, they live with the drip rather than try to fix it. So the narrator realizes that John and Sylvia are just completely repelled by technology. They talk once in a while in as few pained words as possible about it or it all. As in the sentence, there is just no escape from it. The it is a kind of force that gives rise to technology, something undefined but inhuman, mechanical, lifeless, a blind monster, a death force, something hideous they are running from, but know they can never escape. It's all parts and relationships of unheard of things that never make any sense no matter how often you hear about them. I think I'm a romantic. I kind of get that. And their things, their monster keeps eating up land and polluting the air and lakes, and there is no way to strike back at it and hardly any way to escape it. So this novel was written in 1968, right about the time that people were becoming very concerned about the environment, in a large part due to Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, which I think was 60 or 61. And obviously, because technology was becoming so obvious an impact not only on the environment, but in the visual landscape. But many others are also feeling their natural feelings and not trying to imitate anyone. And the natural feelings of very many people are similar on this matter. So when you look at them collectively, as journalists do, you get the illusion of a mass movement, an anti-technological mass movement, an entire political anti-technological left emerging, looming up from apparently nowhere saying, stop the technology, have it somewhere else, don't have it here. So I guess a description of the ecology movement, for example, that we still see constellated on the left, and these days in terms most of all of climate change, is something you still see. You see environmentalists very much advocating a return to a simpler way of consuming, really kind of still advocating running away from technology as much as possible. Reducing the carbon footprint. And obviously, I don't think anyone can really argue the wisdom of reducing waste as much as possible. But the interesting thing is this platform, this climate change platform on the left, never mentions the technology that is just as promising as conservation, perhaps even more so, in dealing with climate change and other aspects of environmental pollution, such as plastic in the ocean. In fact, there are already several companies in the midst of figuring out how to suck carbon emissions out of the air. Yet the children of this early environmental movement seem to have a really hard time accepting that technology could be a large part of the solution. And this more balanced view of technology is summed up by Pirsig in a very famous, I would say, passage. I disagree with them about cycle maintenance, but not because I'm out of sympathy with their feelings about technology. I just think that their flight from and hatred of technology is self-defeating. The Buddha, the Godhead, resides quite comfortably in the circuits of a digital computer or the gears of a cycle transmission, as he does at the top of a mountain or in the petals of a flower. To think otherwise is to demean the Buddha, which is to demean oneself. Now that passage is going to be very important in this book, the theme in there. So I hope that made sense, and I will see you next week for Chapter 2.